Great. Well, thank you so much, Connor. It's an absolute delight to see so many of you here in this beautiful venue tonight. I'm really pleased to be here to discuss what I think is an incredibly important book. I think it's going to be very important for the next Labour government, if and when it arrives. We've got our author here tonight, of course, Will Hutton.
That's me, by the way.
Will is an economist. He's also former editor of The Observer, the newspaper that I work for, the world's oldest Sunday newspaper. And we're very proud that he still writes a column for us. And his new book is called This Time, No Mistakes, How to Remake Britain. And he'll be here signing copies for anybody who would like that at the end of the evening. We also have Alastair Campbell, who is Tony Blair's Director of Communications and Strategy, but he was there between 1994 and 2003. And of course, he'll be a very familiar voice to many of you as co-presenter of one of the UK's most popular podcasts, The Rest is Politics. So it's really great to have Alastair here as well, chipping in with thoughts on the book. But first of all, Will, I'd just like to ask you to give me the elevator pitch for the book. When you say this time no mistakes, what exactly are you talking about?
Well, there's two sets of huge mistakes, I think, that have been made over the last, 45 years. First lot was to do with the revival of free market fundamentalism, laissez-faire economics in different guises, which led to four catastrophic errors. The monetarism of Mrs. Thatcher, the excessive financial deregulation that led to the Great Crash, then austerity, then Brexit, and bookended by Liz Truss. And all of that was informed by a view of the world that has been, that the Brits invented in the 19th century, worked a bit in the first half of the 19th century, but by the time, 100 years ago, my great hero, Maynard Keynes, said, let's kill laissez-faire, the end of laissez-faire. And we thought we had done it with the Attlee government. It was revived by Mrs. Thatcher, putting individualism at the center of the moral, economic, and social universe, and that led to those calamities. But the second mistake was actually that the liberal left didn't have an alternative philosophy to really counter it. The Labour Party was founded in 1900. It never really settled on what its kind of ideology was, except it wanted to promote the worker interest. And one part of the book is to kind of say, well, actually, there's an ethic of socialism, which has worked for all time, I think. It's pro-social. And I trace the antecedents of it. And there's progressive liberalism that was worked out at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, which led to the great reforming government of 1906, 1914. And actually, these two themes in progressive thought, the ethic of socialism and progressive liberalism, should be brought together to form a kind of a philosophy called the we society. Less I, more we, more collective effort, but combined with a recognition for individual agency and individual responsibility. And as I was writing the book, I stumbled upon the clause for the Labour Party, which actually, that's what it tries to do. And so, in a sense, this time no mistakes, I want a decisive break from the world we've been in. I want to move to a high investment economy. I want the public sector to lead that. I want the investment system, savings to be refashioned to support the private businesses that will be crowded in by that. I want that to lift real wages and productivity. I want to bind our fractured society together and an agile state to pull it all together. So I'm calling for, if we have a Labour government, a decisive break from that, and this time no mistakes, both in repudiating that philosophy that's kind of led us, I think, to the past we're in, and striking out anew. There you are.
That was, thank you for that incredibly pithy summary.
That was a
It's
very big building.
great. Well, Will,
That was.
I think there's one man who's going to really matter in terms of creating the type of society and economy that you envisage in your book. Alastair, I'm sorry, it's not Rory Stewart. He is, of course, the man who the polls say is very likely to be our next Prime Minister. What do you think, both of you? Should we ask him what he thinks?
That'd be great. Is he here?
Excellent. Well, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Keir Starmer, the Leader of the Opposition. I bet you weren't all expecting that. I actually did ask Keir before we came on stage today whether he's ever been the surprise guest at an event before, and apparently it's a first time for him. Now, we haven't got Keir for very long because he's got to get back to the Commons for a vote on Rwanda, which is obviously incredibly important. So we're going to make the most of the time that we've got with him. Keir, but first of all, I wanted to start off by asking you, it won't have escaped your attention, I'm sure, that your beloved Arsenal defied expectations and suffered quite the drubbing last night. What lessons do you draw from that?
I'll be straight on this at the Shadow Cabinet tomorrow to remind them that however far you think you are ahead, you've got to keep fighting like you're 5 points behind all of the time. But it is, can I just say, it's really fantastic. Thank you for that welcome. It's really fantastic to be here. This is a brilliant book by Will, my friend. Just as the last book, or not the last book, but The State We're In was a fantastic, defining book of its time. Now we have another one coming along. If you haven't read it, read it. It's an incredible intellectual, historical, political read with some really, really strong themes in there. And it's obviously, I mean, you know, when Will told me what the title was, I thought this sort of pointed to me and said, this time, no mistakes. I could feel the weight of Will coming down on me, but it's a fantastic book. It's a really great book. Read it if you haven't already.
That's a brilliant endorsement, I think.
Oh, thank you.
Keir, so one of the things that's quite central to Will's book is the idea that the place where we found ourselves, it's not just as a result of decisions made by Conservative governments over the last 45 years or so. In fact, Labour governments have got something to answer for as well. What did you make of that aspect of the book?
Well, I think it was really fascinating, and I do think it's worth us just reflecting on previous Labour governments so that we can look forward, I hope, to what I hope will be the next Labour government. And there are always things to learn from previous Labour governments. You should never, ever seek to simply remodel what went before. That doesn't work. Each government is created out of its own circumstances, its own conditions, and has different challenges. But there are things to learn. There's the basic and obvious ones that we can go into before we get to each of the governments. The first is to remember that, you know, barring an argument by some about what happened in the 20s, we've only won from opposition 3 times in the entire history, pretty much, of the Labour Party. Only 3 times. We did it with Attlee, obviously, in 45. We did it with Wilson, okay, sort of a couple of times over, but it was 1 innings. And then we did it in 1997. We don't win from opposition very often, and we achieve absolutely nothing when we are in opposition. I came into politics pretty late in life, having done other things, having been a lawyer, done lots of international cases, run a public service, worked in Northern Ireland, and I've now been 9 years in opposition. And in opposition, you do not change lives for the better. So the first lesson is you've got to win an election. You've absolutely got to win an election. I think what binds those three governments together, each time, 45, 64, 97, the Labour Party glimpsed the future and took people to a better place. And there's a real lesson in that, particularly at the moment, because I think the mood is pretty grim. I think in particular terms, the Attlee government told us that we can be bold, we can build, we can actually change things and lay down foundations for a different kind of society that in that particular case lasted for a very, very long time. Well, the Wilson government, I mean, there's lots of lessons from the Wilson government, obviously, but amongst them is that you can do a lot of radical things. You know, particularly what was done about decriminalisation of the criminalisation of homosexuality, what was done on all those big liberal reforms, the death penalty, all that work that was done was hugely important in terms of defining who we are as a society. And then in 1997, for 13 years, massive advance for so many, whether that was sort of workplace advance, equal rights, whether it was Sure Start, lots of things which we forgot to celebrate then after 2010 for the best part of a decade. So there are things to learn, but each of those governments could and perhaps should have gone further, and I think this is Will's point.
Absolutely.
If you look at...
but more importantly, made a decisive break with this. Attlee did it, Wilson attempted it, Tony Blair made an accommodation, but didn't really I think, fled from it, really. It's down to kind of an incoming Labour government this time to kind of get this combination of ethical socialism and progressive liberalism right, to refashion British capitalism so it works for the common good, I sometimes call it building a floor and a ladder simultaneously.
Yes, I think that's right. And I think it's important that we meet the mood of the country. And I think the two go together. At the moment, the mood across the country, you will be aware of this, is very, very flat. People are genuinely scared about the condition they find themselves in. Almost everybody knows that nothing is working better now than it was 14 years ago, whether it's the health service, public services, the welfare state, the economy and how it's not working. Almost every measure of levelling up has been utterly failed. People have got this sense that everything is broken. But it's not a 1997 moment. I'd be interested in Alastair's views on this. 1997, that song, Things Can Only Get Better, really resonated with the mood of the nation. I don't think the nation's in that place at the moment. I think people are worried, they're anxious, they've lost the belief that their children, the next generation, will necessarily have a better life. This is a terrible place for the soul of the nation. And the two biggest challenges we face, I think, in terms of mindset going into the election, of that group of people who say, I quite like what you're saying here, but everything's so broken, I've lost faith that anybody can mend it. That's a sort of, it's a terribly sort of defeatist, but it's very deep-rooted. Or others that say, after 14 years of this, I quite like what you say, but I don't believe a word anybody says anymore. And those are the two bits of mindset that we need to meet. I think that leads me to Will's point, which is, I am personally convinced, and really interested in people's views on this, that we've got to have a mission-driven government that sets out to transform the country so that we can hopefully take us from where we are now, have an ambition not just to fix the short-term problems which desperately need fixing, whether that's your waiting lists in the NHS, whether it's the NHS dentist that means you could deserts that mean you can't even get an appointment. We've got to fix the short term, but we've also got to fix the fundamentals now. And that will require, this is where I think there's some really interesting stuff in Will's book, this idea of an agile state, a state that says we are going to frame what the future should look like. We are going to have a sense of mission and long-term change that will sustain us through, in the end, I think it'll have to be at least a decade of change, because I don't think it's possible to do all of the change that's necessary in one 5-year go.
Keir, that brings me on very nicely. That brings me on very nicely to my next question, which is that one of the things that your critics sometimes say about you is they're not clear on what would motivate you as Prime Minister. And I've been listening to Louise Casey's series for Radio 4, and one of the things that she said when she was Tony Blair's homelessness czar was that during Tony Blair's first term, there was a real sense that Tony Blair's mission to cut rough sleeping was a driving force, and everyone in the cabinet knew it, everyone else was behind it. So I was just wondering, for you as Prime Minister, what's the one kind of driving thing that would get you out of bed in the morning when you're in number 10?
An economy that works for everyone, which is fair for everyone, drives real equality, where people have security, because we don't have it. We haven't had economic growth of any meaningful sort for 14 years, and we certainly haven't had economic growth everywhere that is measured in the living standards, the security, and the hope that people need across the country. So getting the economy reset and working, functioning, growing, and not just in some parts of the country. I do not want a model of growth that says London and the South East does the heavy lifting and redistribution is a sort of one-word answer for the rest of the country. We have to build a model for the economy that works for every single place. And then things hang off that. And people sometimes say, well, that's, not as uplifting as saying something about rough sleeping or whatever it may be. I think it's completely uplifting because I think it's the bedrock of everything else. Now, there are 5 missions I've got for government, only 5, because I think we haven't got the bandwidth for anything else. Growing the economy is the number one. If we don't turn the economy around, we won't have the wherewithal to take our country forward. The other missions ladder up to that, if you like. So we've got clean power by 2030. This is hugely important, going to renewables by 2030. It's really difficult to do, by the way. People say to me, there's no difference between you and the Tories, or you're not being radical enough. Try getting to clean power by 2030, renewables across the board by 2030. Almost everybody says you can't do it. It's obviously important for our net zero contribution, but also it's lower bills, it's security, so Putin can't put his boot on our throat, and it's the next generation and the generation after that of skilled jobs that go with it.
Can I just jump in on that though? Because one of the really clear themes in Will's book is the need for more investment and the need for more public investment to leverage in the private sector investment and how that is the engine of growth for the economy. But I think some people will look at Labour scaling back the Green Investment Plan and look at the projections which show now actually that Labour levels of investment would be a bit higher than a Conservative government, but not significantly higher. Without that public investment, how does Labour deliver on growth?
Well, let me first take on the 28 billion question, because a lot of people will have their views on that. What I set out was clean power by 2030, and we have costed every single thing we need to do to get there, and we're keeping every single one of those commitments. So the commitment for clean power by 2030 is exactly the same as it always was. The investment, I agree we need investment, which is why we've made that commitment. That's why we want the vehicle of GB Energy, a publicly owned company that makes the investment jointly with the private sector, but gets the yield back to our government, to our taxpayers from that, rather than it going somewhere else. But it's got to be agile, it's got to be clever. An investment can't be a dead weight. It's got to do the work of acting as a catalyst for the private sector. There are no end of businesses that say they want to invest in the UK, but they're not going to do it at the moment because our economy is too unstable, because we've had 5 prime ministers in the last 14 years, because they had 4 chancellors the year before last. That makes a massive difference. So this money that we want to invest has to be agile and clever, and it needs to unblock every stage of the journey for getting to clean power. And it's not all about money. Just bear with me for 1 second. I just want to give you this example because it's tattooed on my head. One of the things we're going to have to do for clean power is to have lots more wind turbines. That's offshore wind turbines and onshore wind turbines, so we can get to clean energy. I asked the CEO of an energy company, if we were trying to achieve our mission, how quickly could his company, his business, build for me a wind turbine farm? And he said, I could have it up for you in 2 years, Keir. I said, oh, that's good. He said, you won't get any power out of it for 13 years because we'll lose 5 years to planning. And once we've lost 5 years to planning, which takes you to 7 years, we'll then use another 6 years because the grid won't start crawling towards the wind farm, until the wind turbine farm, until you show it's ready to be connected up. It's utterly ridiculous and broken. That is partly about money. It's also about having clarity of what the government has to do to sort of bulldoze through the sort of change that we want. That is unsustainable. Scunthorpe Steelworks is another one. They want to go to an electric arc furnace which will produce green steel. It's a fantastic thing that they can do. The workforce and the management have said they can do that by 2027. The grid has said they'll connect them in 2034. So there won't be a Scunthorpe Steelworks. We'll lose that facility. The job of government is to understand that and to drive through that and make sure that we bring about the change that we need for the country.
I want to just got a couple of points. Alastair, you want to say something?
No, my one criticism of Will's book, it will surprise none of you to know, is I think he's very harsh on the new Labour government of 1997, which I think was one of the great radical reforming governments of history, but there we are. I think that Keir's right in everything he says, apart from this thing about the mood. Yes, I think people feel very kind of grungy and very down, but I think it's partly because this government has made us feel like that. And I actually think there is a yearning for that hope and positivity. And what I like about Will's book is the fact that he's kind of taken on the whole sort of the thing about Thatcherism. And where I accept from Will, I think that we were sometimes a little bit too spooked by the whole sort of Thatcher thing. You say Tony made an accommodation. I think there is now the opportunity to make that radical break, actually to kind of rewrite history. What the Tories have done incredibly well is rewrite their own history. And it's falling apart. We're seeing it fall apart now. And I just think it's wide open now for a really confident reclaiming of social democratic values, social democratic policies, and a country that is yearning for really, really big radical change.
I certainly agree with the analysis that this government has beaten the hope out of people. It's a terrible thing to do to a country, which is to take the country in 2010 and form a government and to leave it 14 years later in a worse state than you found it. Doesn't matter which political party you support, that is unforgivable in politics. It's been done, and because they want to distract, they've beaten the hope out of everybody that anything can possibly be different. Because if you've got that kind of record, you have to pretend that nothing can ever change, nothing can be different. So you beat the hope out of people. I think we need to build that hope. I don't shirk from this challenge, and Alastair and I have discussed it many times, as you can imagine, and quite rightly so. We do need that hope, but that hope needs to be absolutely with the feet planted in the ground. It cannot be a hope that people do not think is realistic, which is achievable on the foundation. And so we need to build the hope part. There's no doubt about that, and set out in clear terms the change that we want to bring about. A decade of national renewal is something you might hear Attlee saying about the change you want for the country. A decade because it's going to take time. National because it's got to be across the whole of the country and bring in everybody behind it, and renewal because it's not just about fixing, it's about changing for the better. But it does have to be rooted in the sort of what I call the sort of working class everyday hope that I think is needed. What we can't do is simply try to build hope around the idea that we can suddenly change everything in a hurry, because we can't. And we won't be able to, and that will just, I think, impact even more deeply on the lack of hope that people have. It's an ordinary, everyday hope that we need to build that is solid in its foundations and seen in its results. And I want you and everybody...
Yeah. On that subject of hope, can I just come in and ask you about young people and Labour's offer for young people? Because a really important part of Will's book as well is this idea of the we society and a social contract. And I think young people today, they face some of the highest housing costs in Europe. A middle earning graduate will be repaying on average £50,000 worth of student debt. They don't have defined benefit pensions, so it feels like for young people they're living in a world where there's now an existential need for family wealth. That's going to be terrible for social mobility. So what's Labour going to do about that aspect of the social contract?
First, let me acknowledge exactly everything you've just said, because I think that for the younger generation now, it feels harder than it's been for a very, very long time, for all the reasons that you say. People are carrying huge debt, they're having to go back and live with their parents after college or university, they're unable to get a place of their own. It's very difficult, even with a degree, to get a decent, secure job at the end of it, something which used to be a sort of given. And one of the things that sticks absolutely in my mind, is the fact that statistically more young people today are going to have their futures determined by the income and salary of their parents than their own talent. 2024, Britain in 2024, after 14 years of this government, that has to change completely, and that's why I've not held back from saying we need to smash the class ceiling. It is a class ceiling that we absolutely have to push to one side. Looking again at our schools and our curriculums, looking again at our colleges, our technical colleges, making sure that we celebrate the vocational as well as the academic, and give young people the skills and qualifications that they need for life, and the hope that they need of that secure job, that foundation, the ability to be part of something that is a we. I mean, I need to go back to vote on Rwanda because I want to go back and vote on Rwanda, because the ripping up of the we part of our society, the constant division and enemy finding, is killing politics. It is drawing everybody apart. We've got 7 votes actually on Rwanda tonight, so we're going to be absolutely at it from 8 o'clock onwards. But that stripping away of the we is really, it's as significant now as it was under Thatcher, because this divide, the woke, the division is all about trying to say, you believe in this and I believe in that, you believe in this, you're an enemy of what I believe in. It is deliberately destructive and pulling apart any sense of what we have in common, and that has to be defeated. I think that's really important for young people as well. Finding their way and navigating their way, a sense of collective identity and purpose that is being stripped away. And it'll be really bad in this election, by the way, because this is a government that can't go to the electorate saying, what a brilliant record we've got. You want more of this, don't you? These are all our achievements. They couldn't do that. They can't say it's been pretty tough, but we had fantastic leaders. Surely you want us to continue. So they'll go low. And they'll go into this divide.
There's one, it's shameful really, here I am, north of 70, I discovered Richard Tawney, the great ethical socialist, in his book on equality. And he quotes Francis Bacon as saying, there's no use for muck unless it's spread around. Wealth is like muck, it's no use, it's spread around. And I entitled the chapter after that. I just wondered what here we are in a society with these amazing imbalances of wealth, and where the yield from the wealthy tax yield from the wealthy is actually proportionally less than it was kind of 40 years ago. I mean, what's your view on that? I mean, philosophically, you don't have to give us a kind of something that's going to kill you in the election, but I mean, philosophically, where are you?
Look, redistribution is always an integral and important part of any Labour project and any Labour government. There's no doubt about that. There's no pretending that they haven't busted the economy. We're not in a 1997 position as far as the economy is concerned. It is utterly busted. And what they're doing with the budget and what they'll do with the financial statement if they get that far in September is to burn the available money that could be invested in public services before an incoming Labour government, if we get that far, has the chance to do it. That is the absolute, example of party first, country second that they've got to now. They're not even trying to act in the national interest. They're literally acting in the narrow party interest. So we do need that. But Will, we've also got to create the wealth in the first place. And that we are not doing as a nation. So yes, redistribution is very important, always is to any Labour government. But there's a bigger problem at the moment, and that is we are not growing our economy, and we are not, it's not as if it's even growing in a way that is, good in some parts of the country and not in others. It's not growing meaningfully anywhere. This is then felt keenly in parts of the country that feel that they haven't had a fair share, they can't influence what's going on. That phrase, take back control, was so powerful in 2016, but for a reason that went way beyond any technical question of EU membership, because people around the country started asking themselves, do I have enough control? And over their personal finance, they said, no, I can't make ends meet. Over control of their own communities, they felt no. Over what happens with their politicians, they felt no. And we have to address that sort of burning sense of injustice that's there across the country and turn it around. So yes, redistribution is always an important part of what Labour does, but we've got to tackle the central question, which is we've got to have an economy that is growing and working for everybody across the country.
Keir, thank you so much. You've got to head off now because you've got the votes.
Just as you were raising Brexit as well.
I'm sorry I've got to go, but we've got to go and vote 7 times about this despicable plan that they've got on Rwanda, where a court having ruled that a place is unsafe, for a government then to say we're going to pass a law to change the facts and say it isn't, and in that law we're going to then say nobody can challenge our finding, is something we absolutely have to challenge and goes to the heart of some of the things Will touches on in his book. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very good of you.
Thanks so much, Keir.
Thank you.
Well, blimey.
So, Will, that was quite the endorsement for your book, I think.
I was a bit taken aback, I have to tell you, actually.
I want to come to you first on this question about growth and investment, which is such a big part of your book. And I think quite often it's like a chicken and egg question when you think about this question. So, you know, Labour are saying we'll get growth, and that's how we're going to deliver for our public services. It's how we're going to fix the NHS. It's how we'll do things again like Sure Start, etc. But lots of people would say, well, unless you fix the NHS and you push up rates of public investment, you're not going to get the growth. Where do you think Labour are on that question? Do you think they're striking the right balance, or is there some magical thinking in there?
Well, the core of there's so much going on, isn't there, in your question? I mean, first of all, I mean, he didn't really. I don't think he really kind of grasped what the the Rachel Reeves May's lecture, where she kind of recast the fiscal rules to permit her to borrow for public investment on a really vast scale, in my view. And behind that also sits something I talk about in the book, which is slightly technical, but it's about putting the public balance sheet behind institutions like the UK Infrastructure Bank or the British Business Bank, and saying that we will take the first 10 or 15 or 20% of any loss if a loan you make goes pear-shaped. That could be, you could put the public balance sheet behind that, and that could support 50 billion, 100 billion extra of lending to the UK Infrastructure Bank. They could really bloody go for it if they chose to, and then they crowd in kind of private investment off the back of that, and that means a kind of big refashioning of the way our pension system works, the banks work, and all the rest of it, which again, I mean, there are baby steps in their position, and at least they're there. But if you put that together, you could get the investment levels in the UK, which I think are about 100, 120 billion a year, less than they need to be compared with the average of our major competitors. You could lift it by that amount, and that would see a growth and an increase in tax revenues, which would actually be what you require for the NHS and. And, I mean, I put that question deliberately about the Francis Bacon quote. I mean, I do think it's really, you know, wealth has doubled as a share of national income over the last 40 years, and yet the tax take from capital gains tax, inheritance tax, council tax has kind of remained kind of derisory. And one of the reasons why the tax burden is felt so high, income tax, national insurance, VAT, is because that's where the burden of the tax take is. It's been, and actually refashioning the tax code so that they're kind of the better off and the wealthy put a degree more into the common pot in the name of the we society, kind of plus the tax revenues you get from the kind of growth I'm talking about, would really permit you kind of to get serious about reform of the NHS. I mean, I think is one of the things that really gets to me is the way that if you're middle class and you want to go to university, there's a place for you, and it's uncapped. If you're working class and you want to train or you want to get an apprenticeship, it's capped. So working class kids find if they want to train, find that the supply of places for them is capped. Middle class kids, uncapped. It's the kind of great kind of divide. It's a class divide in the way we structure educational funding, training, which is kind of got to end. Again, you can start to see the way to get the resource to close those kinds of gaps. And and as for social housing, which is, I see Julian Richard in the audience here, written a great book on housing. I mean, absolutely. I mean, we've sold 4.5 million council houses over the last 40 years and not replaced them. And so the social housing stock in the UK is kind of absolutely, the chance of getting kind of a council house or a council flat in large parts of the country, the queues, the waits, and to move from one part of the country to another and to leave your council flat is impossible. And so, you can start to see where the wherewithal would come from to do the kinds of things that would kind of leave this, I think, disastrous kind of economic and social conjuncture we're currently in behind. So there you are, that's my answer.
Great. You're a very clappy audience, I love it. Alastair, do you agree with what Will's hinting at there, which is perhaps Labour are being a bit risk-averse when it comes to things like wealth taxation? Could they be saying more ahead of an election, or do you think they're playing it right very cautiously?
I think the answer can be yes to both. In that, I think it's really quite interesting when you think, if you think of Keir, who's come, he's now gone, so we can talk about him very frankly. No, if you think about it, he's gone in a couple of years from a general sense around him, in the Labour movement, in the media, don't think this guy's got it, don't think this guy can win, to I don't think this guy can lose. Now, it's quite clever, that. It's quite clever. And now I would like for Labour, as I indicated, to have more sense of optimism, more sense of possibility, more ambition. But at the same time, it's quite hard from a political strategy point of view to argue against a campaign which has gone from can't win to can't lose. How big's the majority going to be? And so I think that I think they can do both. I'll tell you when. Do you remember the Hartlepool by-election?
I do.
Not that long ago, in historical terms, Labour lose the Hartlepool by-election. There was all that sort of kerfuffle about, was he getting on with Angela Rayner, and was he going to even quit? This book that Tom Baldwin's written about Keir, he's actually indicated that he was thinking about leaving because there's all this sort of negative chatter around him. And, Keir's my MP and he's a neighbour and I like him. And he came round for a chat and he said this thing which has stuck with me ever since. He said, look, what you guys did, you had successive leaders, successive elections, and eventually Tony Blair won. But it took quite a long time to get there and quite a lot of change. I'm trying to do this in one term. So that's all we've got. And I'm trying to do it in 3 stages. Stage 1, decontaminate the Labour brand. Post Corbyn, anti-Semitism, all the stuff that happened then. Stage 2, show that the Tories are useless and have got to go. Stage 3, set out the alternative. Now, we're now in stage 3. And he's done stage 1 and 2 pretty well. And you could argue that Liz Truss and Boris Johnson have helped in stage 2. They have. Accepted they have. But at the same time, you've got to hand it to the fact that their strategy does seem to be working. Where I'd like to see the levers upped is on the positive agenda and on this sense of giving people the wherewithal, the positivity, the hope that says, I'm going to go and get involved in that. Because I think that's what we need. I think, look, the fact that you didn't even know he was going to come, you've all come out to hear you and 2 old blokes talk about politics. Thank you, somebody's got my book. You can
get that one signed afterwards as well.
So there is massive interest in politics at the moment. There's massive disillusion, but I think that's where Labour in this next stage, I think, really can get a mood going. Listen, think of the joy I'm going to feel, you're going to feel, most of the people in this room are going to feel. The joy at getting rid of the worst government we have ever known, ever, and then turn that into something positive. It's there for the taking.
You're singing from the Observer hymn sheet, Alastair.
There you go.
I want to ask you both what you made of Keir's response on young people, because for me, I do look at some of the issues that young people are facing, and it's kind of it's very hard to see where the answers are coming from on things like housing, on the awful amount of debt that young people are racking up by going to university. Do you think Keir's answer went far enough? I'll come to you first, Will, and then Alastair.
Well, it didn't, obviously, did go far enough, did it? I mean, he has this strategy of kind of minimalism, kind of doesn't want the kind of whole conservative media and political and think tank ecosystem to kind of take him apart in the next 6 to 9 months. I mean, and this minimalism has got him to where he's got to, where an average in the polls of 20-point lead. And it's the old analogy of carrying a Ming vase and not wanting to drop it, which was used for Tony and now is being used for for Keir. But that said, the condition of 18 to 35-year-olds in Britain. You put it all there. We can't carry on kind of loading people with student debt and maybe with apprenticeship debt, if that's the road you go down, to kind of finance vocational training, and then expect them to become part of property owning democracy by supporting the mortgages on house prices on a literally 140-year high. In London, house prices are 12 times average incomes. And we're watching, you can see it around here. It's not just pubs closing, it's schools closing, it's primary schools closing, it's because people can't afford to bring families up in kind of zone 1 and zone 2, and it's a contagion. So there has to be, and the proportion. If you're 35, you're on average spending 2/5 of your disposable income on servicing rent or mortgage. It's so. That's why I saw what I said about spraying the muck around. Council tax, brutally for a London audience, is too low in London, and it needs to be higher.
You can tell it's not standing for election here, can't you?
I don't know whether Paul Johnston's here from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, but he worked out for me that he is great. If I've got this wrong, Paul, you must correct me. But I asked you what the yield would be from property taxation if the system in 1991 had still been in place and we'd revalued kind of residential property values in line kind of with the increase in property prices from then until now. It's astonishing that we're still basing council tax on revalue on 1991 values. It's one of the reasons why property prices, he said £20 billion. You can't get there in one jump, but this is the kind of way we've got to think. It's going to take a decade, but we must do it because people, the Nat Cons talk about the decline in the birth rate. One of the reasons why kind of people are having smaller families or deferring having families until they're well into their 30s, with all the implications for kind of birth rate, is because it's impossible to kind of live with someone you love in your own place and bring up a family. It's impossible. We're killing our civilization and the social housing story is as disastrous. So,
for me, I actually don't understand.
Sorry, I've got a long speech there. But
no.
I don't know what to...
No, but I think you make such an important point on social housing, because the only time this country has ever built enough houses is in the 30 years post-war, when we built significant numbers of houses with public investment as well as private investment. And for me, I just don't understand. I think it's a no-brainer for Labour, as well as their green investment plan. They should have a housing investment plan, and they should say, we're going to invest X billion, we're going to borrow to invest, we're going to build affordable housing for rent for young people in city centres, and we're going to give them guaranteed, tenancies for 3 to 5 years in their 20s, so they can move somewhere where there are jobs. I mean, to me, that just seems like a good idea, no?
Yeah, it's a great idea.
Putting a face,
it's a
Alastair.
great idea. And I think there's a chance that Labour will do that kind of thing.
Excellent.
I've just been a couple of weeks ago. I was in Australia, and something very interesting happened in Australia recently, which is that the Labour government got into power, defeated Scott Morrison, who was a kind of, Johnson-type populist leader, pretty grim, pretty awful, dragged the mood down, like Keir was rightly saying the Tories have done here. And one of the promises they made, the Labour Party, was that they would not interfere with Scott Morrison's 3-stage tax plan. Okay, he had this quite complicated tax plan. They've had a budget, and what's the first thing they've done? They've gone back on it. And what's the response been? Unbelievably popular. Now, I'm not advocating breaking election promises, something that we never did. we had a pretty good record on that. But it's very, very interesting how that has happened, because what they've managed to do, and it may come back to bite them, but thus far, the Liberals, their Tory party, can't even bring themselves to attack this change because it's so popular. Because what they've done is they've basically changed the tax system to benefit the less well-off at the expense of the very well-off. Now, they've done it in power. They got into power in part by keeping quiet about it. Now, I think that what Keir is trying to do is, and I know that Will's here to sell his book, but I really recommend Tom Baldwin's book on Keir. It's a very interesting read because, and I'm going to ask you this as a show of hands. Okay, you probably all agree with the tone of what we've been saying. We'd like more, we'd like faster, we'd like, bolder and bigger and etc. But hands up if you kind of get what he's trying to do. You see?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Yeah.
And so I think we should go with that. And Will, when we were backstage, Will was saying to me, how do you get people who are disillusioned, who think that Labour's not perfect, how do you get them anyway to try and stick with it? And I know lots of people who are not happy with Labour over policy A, policy B, decision C, decision D. But in the end, we've just got to persuade ourselves and each other that politics has never been a choice of two different forms of perfection. At the moment, it's a choice between, as I said earlier, this truly awful, wretched government and something that can be better. And so I think that I'm hoping, the reason why I'm recommending Tom's book is because at every stage of Keir's career and life, he's kind of been a bit underestimated all the time. And then he's set himself some pretty big ambitions and he's always overreached. And so I'm hopeful that he's going to be more Attlee, maybe, than Blair. And I think that would be quite a good thing.
Yeah.
And you'll approve of that.
Oh, I once said to him, and one of the quotes I came across was Kenneth Morgan is a biographer of Attlee, and he went to see went to see Attlee, and kind of in the biography discusses kind of what Attlee's idea of socialism was, and Attlee replies, and it was he uses it in a TV interview actually that he gave in the mid-50s. He says, "Well, I follow," he said, "the greatest citizen of this borough, William Morris, who said socialism is fellowship, and fellowship is the life of the world, the hope of the world." And that's my definition of socialism. And I think that Keir, when he hears that, kind of immediately kind of thinks, that's me. He believes in fellowship. And I think he's also he also believes in kind of pulling the shadow cabinet together as a team, and he does have some. He does have not Attlee type beasts, but he's got some quite good. He's got a potential kind of cabinet that could be as kind of game changing as the Attlee cabinets were. And there's people coming through who I think will get into the cabinet in year 1 or year 2 of a Labour government. So I do agree with you. I think there's, he's. And the other thing that I think about Attlee and Keir is this, and I make this point in the book. I just talk about my book and not Tom's. What Attlee's always seen as the kind of socialist lion, really, the great socialist. But actually, he, as Attlee's wife said, Ken, talking to the biographer, Ken, you must understand, Clem was never a rabid, was never a socialist, or he's not a rabid socialist. And at that, Attlee, who'd been half asleep, sucking his pipe, jerked, and she qualified and lost the rabid. But he didn't really cavil in this notion when she went on to say that most of their friends were conservatives. And I think that people don't get the kind of Labour government of 45 to 51. I mean, yes, I had brilliant people like Nye Bevan, who was an ethical socialist guy, but they were also kind of pursuing Keynesian policies. He was a progressive liberal. Beveridge was a progressive liberal, a new liberal. And he blended this new liberal tradition, progressive liberalism, and the Beveridge report is very interesting because, it's designed to provide social insurance for all, in a way we all know, but carefully designed not to take away individual responsibility or individual agency or responsibility for your own life. And actually, Attlee buys that. So, Attlee is kind of blending progressive liberalism, with its roots in the 1906, 1914 kind of liberal government, with the socialism that people wanted after the war, and blended it to produce this great reforming administration, which then in the 50s, people like Macmillan and Churchill himself, who himself was a new liberal for a bit of his career, were prepared to kind of run with. They built a consensus. And I see kind of some things he said tonight, kind of eyes pricked up. And I put the point to him about the Francis Bacon thing, about kind of wealth is like Mark. He said he didn't resile from the notion in philosophic terms that Labour's about redistribution. And I thought, that's interesting. And he also he wants to make an economy work for everybody, he said. He can't do that without getting a capitalism where the stock market rises, so that companies like Shell kind of aren't talking about relocating their quotation from the London market to New York. He's got, he kind of gets this. So we're bound to be disappointed, you and me, but I think there's really grounds. I'd much rather characterize where we are as the political glass being half full and potentially fillable, if that's the right way. I'm not sure that's right, actually. Fillable? Anyway, fillable. Yeah, I think fillable, yeah. I need a good slow rather than half empty and emptying. So, it was great you give him the applause that you gave him, because I think that kind of lifted his spirits, He doesn't, I don't think he doesn't get enough kind of quasi-neutral audiences, we'll lean into this.
Oh, yeah, really neutral.
Absolutely.
I can feel the neutrality of the room.
It's not the Labour Party conference, is it?
Not far off. Hands up anybody who's going to vote Tory.
I've got one in the back.
One brave man. Good, well done, sir.
No, but it's not. It isn't a Labour Party conference where they kind of, you've got to stand for 3 minutes at every kind of,
No, but I'll tell you, a lot of this depends on kind of what mood we're in. So Keir and I have had many arguments about Brexit. I want Labour to be far more upfront about the damage that Brexit is doing and the absolute necessity to meet growth mission number 1 to fix it.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah. And I also am absolutely obsessed with this belief that And I felt it last week when the Mail and the Tories were going mad about Angela Rayner yet again. I want Labour to stand up and absolutely say that the restoration of standards in politics and public life is going to be fundamental, and I want them to do it and mean it. And likewise, there is stuff he mentioned schools and the curriculum, there's stuff in the curriculum that I think you can really, really make some big changes. Now, is that the stuff that they're talking about? No. Does that frustrate me? Yes. But I'm, been around long enough to know that provided you've got a sense, and I think I think the country is getting to know Keir in a way that it hasn't, and it won't unless and until he gets into power. But I think there's something in there that is kind of fundamentally decent and does have values and is tough. And Will makes the point. I mean, Will writes in the book about, probably most of you will know that I don't have a lot of time for much of our media, present company excluded.
Glad to hear it.
Yeah, but it is a factor. It is a factor. We danced with the devil, and Keir's doing a bit of dancing with the devil. And I would like him to commit to doing Leveson Part 2, the whole press corruption stuff. He's decided not to. I understand why. I'd rather that he did. But all the time, I think it's important that we're all kind of just a bit grown up about this and understand, as he said, if you don't get into power, you can't do anything. You spend your whole, life, as many of us have done for decades, kind of in frustration, in anger, just wanting the country to change but not being able to will it. So I think it's more that even if the glass is only half full, it's better than the alternative, and it's the alternative we've got to help him get rid of.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to open it up to questions in the audience very shortly, so do have a think about what you'd like to ask Will and Alastair. There's one more question I just wanted to put to you both first. And Will, you mentioned Beveridge, which of course brings us on to poverty and child poverty.
Yep.
We've got rising levels of child poverty. Almost a third of British children now live in relative poverty, which I think is a stain on a country as rich as ours.
Yeah.
We've got a widening attainment gap at school, partly buoyed by pandemic learning loss. And last week we had new research from the Institute for Fiscal Studies showing that in its early incarnation, Sure Start was actually fantastically effective at closing the attainment gap. What is Labour going to do about child poverty and the fact that for children, growing up in poorer households, that will affect them, we know, for the rest of their lives in terms of their education, employment and health outcomes? What do you think Labour is saying enough on that?
No. I mean, look, I mean, I'm going to end up repeating your question, Sonia. We have the shortest 5-year-olds in Europe. And there's attempts in kind of right-wing webinars to suggest that's because we've been deluged by kind of immigrants who are small. And they have, but we all know the reason. The reason is that the large parts of our cities, the levels of nutrition are kind of disastrously poor. And people's teeth are phenomenally, kind of just decaying. And the amount of dental pain and people are going through is extraordinary. And kids, And I thought this breakfast club commitment by kind of Keir and team was a good one. But I think, of course, it got kind of criticised for being the nanny state. One of the things I do in the book is I talk a bit about Harold Macmillan and his book The Middle Way, written in 1938. A Tory who writes a book as, in some respects, as kind of aggressively radical as the state we're in, or This Time No Mistakes. I was really taken aback. Keynesian wants to really reshape the British financial system and do all the things I've talked about how to get growth in 1938. But his big thing is the impact of poverty on kind of life expectancy, lived experience, and just hunger and the impact it's having on people's lives and the illness and and deprivation that follows from it. And so he wanted to establish a national nutrition board that would instruct every local government in the country to make certain every single family had minimal nutritional levels every day. And he set out kind of what it would cost and what that would be. And I was just thinking of kind of what a Conservative put that on the table in 1938 and saying that it was imperative to kind of keep democracy on the road and to kind of avoid the temptations of going communist and all the rest of it, and it was necessary to fight fascism and all those things that you would think in 1938. But the reaction to it was kind of, well, that's not a bad idea. You know, spool forward to 2024, and the reaction to the Breakfast Club is kind of, oh, you know, how dare the state intrude into family choices? You know, kids can arrive at school kind of at 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, you know, hungry. That's fine. So I do think that there needs to be that kind of Millanesque thinking about, you know, our kids. As I said earlier, the life chances of you know, it shouldn't be true that actually that your life chances depend so completely, as they do in the UK, about from whose womb you've sprung. The circumstances of the family into which you are born. I mean, I quote the great kind of American philosopher John Rawls. You know, if you didn't know who you were going to be born to, the good society is one in which it shouldn't matter behind a veil of ignorance into which society you were born into. We are so miles away from that in 2024, and I just you see the kids playing in the playground of a primary school, and you think, what's their life going to be like over the next 10, 15, 20 years? What's my generation done to kind of give them kind of the possibilities that I had growing up in the 50s and 60s? You know, so your point is well made, and it would be great to see kind of the Labour Party picking up Alastair's point, kind of being brave about our children in the way that you've described.
Alastair, one of the things that New Labour really did was tackle child poverty through tax credits and redistribution. And if you look at the figures, the average family in the poorest decile, so the poorest tenth of families with children, has lost £4,000 a year on average as a result of conservative changes to the tax benefit system. How on earth can Labour fix this without directing more cash at poor families? A lot of that is in work poverty, by the way, of course, as you well know.
Yeah, they can't. And I think they know that. And this thing, I think it's right that our poorest children are now poorer than children in some of the traditionally poorest countries in Europe. Yeah. I'll tell you one of the things that's happened is that poverty, and to be fair, Gordon Brown's still banging on about this relentlessly, and he's right to do so. Poverty has just kind of fallen off the media and political agenda.
I agree.
And that is really, really dangerous because, one, it's terrible for those people that they feel that they're voiceless, that they're not part of the mainstream debate. And secondly, I think that is further opening the door to the populists who will come along and say, you've been let down by the mainstream, you've been let down by the main parties, etc. So Labour has got to put poverty right at the heart of its agenda. Again, I'm hopeful that they will. And the point is, you know, it's interesting, Will mentioned the thing about, you know, diet and so forth, and then we had exactly the same reaction. You mentioned teeth. West Streeting came along and said they were going to be, you know, teaching children how to brush their teeth. Now, on one level, it is absurd and obscene that we're even having to have that conversation. But the truth is that we are having to have that conversation. And that teaching kids the value of dental hygiene is a fit and proper thing to do in schools. And yet, when that happened, you had the usual suspects screaming about the nanny state. The truth is, we're going to have a bit more of the nanny state. Sure Start was nanny state in the eyes of those who criticised it. And I've got to say, I welcomed Paul's report last week. I thought it was a really impressive piece of work. But the fact is, getting rid of Sure Start is one of the worst acts of vandalism that this lot have done. And it's because they didn't invent it. But it's also because deep down, I'm sorry to say this, and I hope, is he gone? No, he's still there. I'm sorry to say this to the guy who's still going to vote for them. I actually am afraid have reached the conclusion they genuinely don't care about that stuff. Their whole messaging is focused very, very narrowly on a section of the electorate that they think put them in power, that they think gave them Brexit and all the stuff that's followed since then. And I think it's utterly obscene that we now have, we used to call it the underclass. We now have a very sizable section of our fellow citizens who are they've just vanished from the political debate. And the Labour Party's got to get them back into the centre of the political debate because, again, their growth mission won't happen without them.
I would now like to open it up to questions from the floor. I'm going to take them in threes. I'm going to go to the lady over there, first of all. Thank you. There's a roving mic that's going to come round.
Oh, she's the one with my book.
Oh, excellent. That's not why I picked her.
Got taste.
Good evening. My name's Colette Hazeldine. I'm about to launch a business called greenstableuk.org, which will give 68% of gross profits to animal, environmental and energy vulnerable people causes. And in preparing my business for launch, I've looked at the 7 Nolan principles of ethical standards in public life, how to apply it to a private enterprise. And it's because I'm new to all of this, I'm shocked at how little that is actually being adhered to in public office. Now, I can't wait for the general election, but why is it we can't do something now to force our elected officials to stick to those standards?
Great, thank you very much. And then if you don't mind just passing the mic one forwards, the gentleman just in front of you had a question. I'm looking for one more question as well. All right, great, excellent. I'll go to the lady right at the back there in the white afterwards. So, yeah.
Okay. Hi, my name's Noah Hughes. I've recently founded a think tank called the Centre for Systemic Economic Thinking. This question isn't directly related to our research, but hints towards where we're going. So tonight there's been a lot of talk about growth and growing the economy. But Keir also observed that growth isn't felt by all. Does this mean we are looking at the wrong metrics, and therefore policy is being guided by wrong economic theory?
Thank you. And then lady in the white over there. Have you got a mic?
What are you launching?
Oh, she hasn't got a mic. Yeah.
So hopefully a Labour government, because I am standing in the next general election in South
Hey,
Derbyshire.
vote for her!
Thank you, thank you. So to your point, both of you, I'm out talking to people every day, every week on their doorstep, every day if I could, quite frankly, and I see the change in their faces from absolute despair to hope. I see that move across their face as they talk to me. My question is, I have a plan for South Derbyshire myself. I know that the Labour Party has a plan nationally, but if we get into power, God willing, if we get into power, how long do you think it's going to take for people to start to feel the benefit of it? Because there'll be this hope getting up to a general election, and then there'll be joy that we've won the general election, God willing, touching wood, before people go from going, oh, you're all the same, to, oh my goodness, I'm feeling this.
Thank you very much. Will, I'm going to come to you first, if that's all right, on the question about whether we've got the right indicators of growth.
Yeah, the strategy, wasn't it? Economic theory, yeah.
Yeah, but I thought you asked about whether we're measuring the right thing. Yes. Yeah.
There's a whole, gosh, this is, I do discuss this a bit actually. I've talked about this public investment, but it's going to have a huge kind of environmentally, it's going to have a huge environment bias. I mean, we have to take not just the target for net zero, but the wider issues of sustainability and biodiversity and all of that, fundamentally seriously. But you can't get anywhere, whether it be the kind of water companies or the kind of grid, unless you have the kind of resources going into kind of investment. So if I understand, what's happened in economic theory in the last kind of 25 years is that, I mean, in the 80s and 90s, the idea was that public borrowing crowded out private borrowing because private business would do the investment, and they'd be deterred by higher interest rates if public borrowing crowded their efforts out. That now been turned on its head. We're now talking about the old Keynesian proposition that actually public investment crowds in business investment. And the character of public investment, if it's focused on leveling up, if it's focused on particular kinds of R&D, kind of biotech and medtech, if it's focused on kind of environment, a drive to net zero, will crowd in the kinds of companies that are doing that kind of thing. And you will start to change the kind of balance of your economic structure. So that's my answer to your question, I guess. I'm just repeating myself, but that's where I understand economic theory has got to. It's a kind of contemporary Keynesianism. Of course, there are constraints to public investment. Of course, you have to get returns from it. Of course, it has to be part of these 5 missions that Keir set out. But I am really hopeful that will happen and happen at scale. And to pick up the point from Derbyshire, South Derbyshire, how long will it take to come through? Look, it needs to come through within 2 or 3 years. The politics of the UK at the minute with reform, where the Tory party have got to, kind of a politics of hatred, really, kind of emerging, and Europhobia. It's very dark. And keeping that at bay requires that this kind of policy framework that we're talking about kind of works and actually starts to manifest itself within 2 or 3 years. I mean, the build-up will take longer. It will take 6, 7, 8 years. But I think that signs of improvement should be visible within 30 months, is my answer to your question.
Thanks, Will. I'm going to bring you in, Alastair, in just a second. I just need to say, sorry to jump in, that there are 2 mics on the balcony, and if you want to ask a question, you need to queue on either side, and I will come to the balcony after. So, Alastair, what's going to you?
I'm going to link the other 2 questions. I think the answer about why I'm one of those sad people who can quote the Nolan principles without looking them up. Honesty, openness, objectivity, selflessness, integrity, accountability, and leadership.
Well done.
Why? Thank you. Why did I memorize those? Because I was convinced the minute that Boris Johnson ridiculously became Prime Minister, I was convinced that ultimately they were going to be his downfall. And I'm glad to say I think I was proved right in that. Johnson did not go because of the Brexit. He didn't even go because of Partygate. He went ultimately because even his own ridiculous party realised he smashed every single one of those principles. Why are they not more central in the debate? Partly, I think, because Labour don't make them more central. I think they should, and I hope that they will during the campaign. I think they will. But also because we do have the media that we've got. Just look at what's happened recently with Angela Rayner. An utter non-story, so far as I can work out. And yet newspapers which are ignoring sort of willy-waving, honey-trapping MPs, ignoring, COVID multi-million-pound contracts to their mates, ignoring £50 million donations that get you a peerage or a knighthood, I forget which it was, and yet we'll go for that. So it's partly the media and it's partly the Tories. But I think ultimately it's about Labour saying we're going to put this at the heart of our debate. The thing about, I think 2 to 3 years is a problem. That's why, you see, I think this stuff, public standards, changes that you can make to the curriculum, the stuff that you can do early on that signals change. And that's when I said earlier about the joy that many, many people are going to feel. You've got to tap into that straight away by making change. And a lot of it doesn't have to cost money. If I think about some of the big changes that we made early on, Bank of England was obviously a massive change, Bank of England independence. Now, that was, I would hope most people would agree, kind of net positive to the economy, net positive certainly to our political fortunes. And then when you talk then about getting the economy growing, once that happens, you've got to show that you are genuinely doing the things that you said you were doing, putting flesh on the words. So when Keir says an economy that works for all, not just certain parts of the country, that's going to mean something. So what are we going to do about devolution to the regions? What are we going to do about more elected mayors and all that sort of stuff, which I hope will happen. So I think that it's not going to be, Will's right that the populist stuff's going to be very, very difficult. You know, you look at the European elections going on at the moment, I don't think the far right are going to do as well as people say, but they're going to do far better than they should. Okay? Now we, in a way, because we've got a pretty right-wing conservative government and you've got Farage and Reform hanging around as well, that is our version of that problem. But that problem with a Labour government, with a media that is going to be pretty vile about a Labour government, that is going to become difficult quite quickly. So we have to be showing people all the time we're making change that is a benefit to their lives. And, you know, it's not going to be easy, but I hope you win.
Have we got some mics on the balcony now? Is that excellent? So oh, wonderful. We can have our first question from the balcony.
Hi, my name is Usuma. I'm a Year 12 student at Mulberry School for Girls. I'm 17 years old, and I'm also the young mayor for Tower Hamlet. And I just wanted to quickly ask, you said earlier that there has been a high interest in politics recently. As a young person, I severely disagree. I think apathy persists in politics. Young people are overlooked and ignored by policymakers. Politicians ignore the electorate, and we have seen this recently with the public outburst with the events in Gaza. Those in safe seats have no voice. Is it time for a change to a system of proportional representation? Thank you.
Well, I think that cheer was actually bigger than the cheer you all gave Keir, so that's pretty impressive, really. I'm going to take a couple more questions. Can I see some hands? Great, we'll go to the gentleman there with the sunglasses on his head. Sorry, that's just the easiest way of identifying you.
Hiya, my name's Sam, I'm 22, actually former student of yours, Will, from back in the day.
All right, welcome, good to see you.
Yeah, I know that Keir is looking at what Joe Biden's doing in the United States and specifically at what they're doing on the economy. But one of the things that is increasingly being pointed out that Biden might have missed out on is the democratic renewal aspect of the reason why Trump was elected. And I worry that debates around, say, reform of the House of Lords, stuff like that, have been swept under the rug by the cost of living crisis. And do we need to focus on democratic renewal as much as economic renewal?
Great.
Absolutely is the answer.
And one more question. Oh, lady at the front here.
Hi, my name's Gabrielle. I'm old. I'm just concerned.
I think the term is middle-aged these days.
I've got my senior rail card. Anyway,
I think I understand where Keir's coming from in one point, and something that Alastair said, which is, having been around the Obama campaign, there was this huge expectation set about we're going to win, we're going to do this, and we're going to change things. And maybe we should set our sights a little lower and exceed them. So from that point of view, do you agree with that or not? Rather than going rah-rah, we're going to do this and we're going to do that, 5-year, 10-year plan.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. So, Will, I can tell you're salivating at the prospect of answering questions on House of Lords reform and proportional representation.
It's a big theme in the book. I mean,
I know it is.
You're going to love the book if you. I mean, look.
Yeah, my book's written for young people.
Proportional representation. 1908 was there was a parliament. There was an inquiry on it. It recommended in 1910 we should have proportional representation. In 1918, when the Parliament Act came through at the last years of the First World War, there was another debate in the House of Commons, and there could have been a majority for proportional representation if Ramsay MacDonald hadn't plumped for first past the post, and so it goes on. And if you look at the course of the last 125 years, consistently, proportional representation has thrown up a House of Commons who does not reflect the body of opinion in the country. It could be in 1951 when actually Labour had won the popular vote by kind of some margin, but didn't have enough, didn't win, as you know, the seats in the House of Commons. It could have been in 1929 when actually the Liberals and the Labour Party together kind of trumped the Tory vote, and there could have been a majority for a much more sure-footed reaction to slump didn't happen. And. I mean, the opposite, the PR kind of conferred in 1983 a second-term Tory government when actually the then SDP and the Labour Party kind of outpolled the Tories. And so it goes on. The time has come, I think, for us to kind of take the way we vote much more seriously. We can't go on with the most primitive voting system you can conceive of, which is first past the post. And it segues into the whole point about democratic renewal that was made. I mean, if in 2050 we are still with an unreformed House of Lords, with nearly by then 1,000 peers who will have been appointed, and even if hereditaries get abolished, I think they will probably be in the first year of a Labour government, but not much more. There's no commitment to have an elected kind of the elected Senate that Gordon Brown called for. You know, we will live in a failed state. You know, this question of proportional representation and having a democracy that actually reflects our opinion, that actually there's a public square where ideas like this can be exchanged and acted on, is fundamental to the vitality of a civilization. So these are really, really important questions, and you know, I try to drive it home in the book. Thank you.
Yes. Alistair, are you as enthusiastic? And also this point about youth apathy, which I think is very important as well.
No, by the way, I wasn't saying earlier that there isn't a lot of apathy. There is a lot of apathy. I was making the point, I think there is also a real deep interest in politics at the moment, partly driven by the fact that there's so much frustration about it and about this government. But, you know, I know we're all on sort of mega book plug, but I deliberately wrote my last book, designed...
3 books to buy.
No, you buy wills tonight, but I genuinely worry that if we don't fire up the next generation, and if we don't inspire them, and if we don't make them feel that they should be involved in politics, then I really worry about where our politics is going. Because the more that you leave the space to the kind of, you know, the populists, then the more they're going to take advantage of that. So I completely hear what you say, and I agree with it. We're not disagreeing on the main point there. The point about, and I understand why people feel so angry about Gaza, and I understand why people feel angry about Labour's position on it. Again, I try to explain to people why I think they're acting in the way that they do. It's partly related to the Ming Vase strategy, and it's partly about being clear about there's only so many battles that you can fight. On the point about democratic reform and renewal, I would like to see, again, I'd like to see Labour put this right at the heart of it. I'd like to see them lower the voting age. I'd like them to bring compulsory voting. I'd like them to have proper political education in schools, because frankly we don't have political education in schools unless you do A-level. And on PR, I think, I blow hot and cold, I'll be honest. When we were in power, getting very, very large majorities, on around 40% of the vote, you know, that was a factor in our thinking. Where I agree with Will, I think the country's now ready for that change. You won't get that change unless you put it in the manifesto. Labour are not going to put it in the manifesto. So if he's talking about a 10-year process of national renewal, I think that is a second-term project. But I think it's one whose time is coming, and I think your generation's got to fight for it.
Right, we've got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to take 2 more questions, but I'd appreciate it if you could keep them really brief. There's a lady over there with her hand up. Do you mind just putting it up again? So that, brilliant. And we'll also go to the gentleman right at the back, so if somebody else with the roving mic can go to him afterwards, that'd be fantastic. Yeah.
He's walking away from the microphone now. He's
yeah,
coming back.
Go for it.
Hi, I'm Fee. I'm from South London. I just want to talk a bit about climate change, which has become one of the polarising issues of our time. Now, I'm from what I would probably call an underclass background, but I'm probably experiencing a bit of social mobility at the moment. What I would say is that it really misses the mark, like many of the things that come out of, I think, often middle-class thought leaders, not direct at yourselves, but just in terms of how this goes. And one of the examples I was going to give, keeping it really short, is in my local area in Peckham, they're trying to introduce a CPZ. Now, this is causing a lot of uproar, and people often come with very condescending arguments about end of the world, doomsday stuff, and your health from car emissions, when really, the people who have driveways are the middle classes, and they keep their cars, and the people who are poorer have to give up their cars. Lots of people that I know live on estates. You can't even get a bike hanger, and if you see bike theft in my area, it's pretty damn high, so nobody wants to get a bike. So how can we make sure that climate policy is actually inclusive? Because it's stuff like that that opens up the debate to populists who then take advantage, because we do need to think about climate change, but right now it's not equitable, and we're not thinking of the right things.
Thank you.
Thank you. I wasn't the Tory, by the way. I wasn't the Tory before. I have a question that people here are probably too polite to ask because you're English, but I'm not, so I'll ask it. Will, what do you blame the Blair government and your friend for?
What,
you have to buy his book.
What do I blame the Blair government? I didn't see where I... Well,
you can keep it brief.
Which should I do first? There's,
Never.
There was the environment. Look, I mean, on the... I clap with the audience. I mean, I completely agree with you. And I think there is a... we need to customize this kind of green policy so that they do they can be owned by the entire population. Your point is well made. I sometimes feel it myself, actually. That said, I mean, I'm not pushing back. I'm just adding a full stop to what you said. The climate is changing visibly in front of our eyes. The wettest kind of, February and March on record, and kind of alarming kind of warming of Antarctica. The Arctic is kind of disappearing in front of our eyes. Kind of the glaciers in the Alps are kind of retreating at a pace that no one anticipated. I mean, actually things are much more serious than even some of the catastrophists were saying kind of even 18 months ago. So, for me, I mean, I kind of agree with you, and I think that it behoves kind of, if you like, middle-class people like me who kind of think these things, to find a way of fashioning our response, which actually simultaneously recognizes the urgency of what we have to do, and by the way, we carry on kind of giving a lead or being in the front rank of nations giving a response. Otherwise, others don't. I mean, retreating from a leadership position was a disaster. So that kind of simultaneously, but to reinforce that something must be done, even while we cast it in a way that would be friendly to folk in Peckham. What can I say about Tony Blair? What do I blame him for? I blame Tony Blair for 2 or 3 big things, actually. I blame him for not making a stronger case for the European Union, and actually, funny enough, for Euro membership, which I think would have been a good thing to have done, and being more measured about, and being more
I think you should have a word with Gordon about that one.
Yeah. So I blame him for not taking kind of as seriously as I think he should have done the reform of British capitalism and actually reconstructing the City of London, which is there in the state we're in, and didn't want to run with it. But also, I have to say, the Iraq War. I mean, that was an occasion where the Europeans were right and the Americans were wrong, and it was obvious actually, kind of in 2002 as we in the build-up, what was going to happen, and I think that David Miliband made this point, kind of at the Hay Festival last year, where he kind of recanted. He said it was a huge mistake, because not only was it a mistake for kind of what it did to Iraq and the British lives that were lost and all the rest of it. Actually, we screwed up. We weren't very good at being military, and we couldn't hold Basra without the Americans and all of that. But the big thing is that when you're trying to rally the global south to your side in the battle in Ukraine, they just think, well, hold on a moment, you know, you said one thing over Iraq and another thing now. You know, we had double standards, and it was such a calamity at every level. We didn't have to do it. We didn't have to side with the Americans. It compromised our position in Europe. So for me, kind of many of the seeds of what's gone wrong since 2010 are due to those three things. But I would say this, that actually, in fairness to kind of, you know, they did invent Sure Start, and we did have 3,500 Sure Start centres in 2010. So, you know, you have to kind of calibrate your criticism of the Blair government. I mean, there were kind of real social gains alongside kind of big errors.
So I notice we're on 2031. Look, I can sit here all night and relitigate Iraq if we have to. I suspect that people have probably heard me talk about that enough in the past. I do really push back on the Europe point. I think Tony is probably the most pro-European Prime Minister we've ever had. But the difference between... I think it was interesting listening to Will tonight, and I made the crack earlier about, you know, you can tell he's not standing for election here. You know, part of that, and I mentioned Gordon in relation to that, so there's Will saying, I wish we'd joined the Euro. Now, we could have a massive argument about whether that was the right thing or the wrong thing to do. We could have a massive argument about the state of the Euro now. But the truth is, at the time, that Tony probably was quite keen to do that, for all sorts of reasons, politically it was completely impossible. Now, as it happens, read my diaries, I was on Gordon's side in the argument, but it was a very big argument going on inside the government. So, and I think that the thing that this highlights in a way is that, and this is relevant to if Keir becomes Prime Minister, there's never been such a thing as a perfect Prime Minister, there's never been such a thing as a perfect government. You cannot, all cliche time, you cannot please all the people all the time. But I think you do have to judge people in the round, and one of the reasons why I will defend the Labour government that I worked for to my death is that I think when I look back at the change that was made and I look now at the extent to which that change has been, I think our biggest failure was actually that we didn't cement well enough the changes that we made so that this lot came along and they've been able to undo far too much of it.
That's true. I agree with that.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for this evening. Will's book will be for sale at the back of the hall, so you can go and pick one up.
Is it the back of the hall or up here?
No, it's for sale at the back, and then you're going to sit here and sign books for people.
I see, okay.
So do go and pick up a copy of the book and then bring it to the front, and Will sign it for you. Huge thanks to Will for your insights this evening. It's an absolutely fantastic book. I really recommend buying it and reading it. And Alastair, it's been amazing to have you on the platform as well. And of course, we will all want to thank Keir Starmer in his absence as well. And to all of you for coming along this evening and being such a lively audience. And thank you for your questions. So yeah, good evening.
Thank you.